Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with Taddy Noy and continuing the discussion with Exodus chapter 27. Well, when we arrived at Exodus 27, we're deep in the heart of the tabernacle instructions. By now, the narrative has moved from the dramatic rescue out of Egypt and the awe-inspiring revelation at Sinai to something that might seem on the surface far less thrilling. Blueprints. Yet these blueprints are more than ancient architectural plans. They're theology in three dimensions: anthropology in wood and bronze, and a window into how God's covenant people understood his presence among them. In this discussion, I want us to step into that ancient world and explore the historical, cultural, and theological richness embedded in the instructions for the altar of burnt offering, the courtyard, and the oil for the lampstand. The first portion of Exodus 27 focuses on the altar of burnt offering, also known as the bronze altar. It was to be made of acacia wood, a material native to the Sinai and Arabian deserts, known for its durability and resistance to rot. Acacia trees were not towering giants. They were thorny, twisted, and often small. Yet in the hands of a skilled craftsman, their wood became strong and long-lasting. This choice of material wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. God takes what is humble and shapes it into something holy. In an environment where resources were scarce, this wood was a natural choice, but it also spoke to the resilience of God's people, formed like the acacia wood to survive in the harsh and unforgiving landscape. The altar was to be overlaid with bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Though in the ancient Near East, tin was often scarce and expensive, meaning much of what was called bronze could also be copper mixed with arsenic. Bronze was associated with strength and permanence. In biblical imagery, bronze often signifies judgment, solid, unyielding, enduring through fire. The altar's bronze covering ensured that it could withstand the intense heat of sacrifices day after day. From an anthropological standpoint, this altar was more than a cooking station for offerings. It was a central axis of Israelite life. Sacrifice was the heartbeat of their worship. Every offering told a story of atonement, thanksgiving, or fellowship, and every story reinforced their identity as God's covenant people. The size of the altar, about 7.5 feet square and about 4.5 feet high, placed it at the center of the activity in the courtyard. Its height made it visible to all who entered, a constant reminder that approach to God required sacrifice. The 4 horns on its corners, also covered in bronze, carried both practical and symbolic meaning. Practically, they were points where the sacrificial animals could be bound. Symbolically, horns in ancient Near Eastern culture represented power and protection and salvation. In Israelite ritual, blood was applied to these horns, signifying that atonement radiated from the altar outward, reaching to the far corners of the covenant community. The altar was portable, equipped with rings and poles for transport. This portability reflected the semi-nomadic lifestyle of Israel in its wilderness. Worship was not bound to one geographical location, but moved with the people. This is deeply anthropological. In contrast to the fixed temples of Egypt or Mesopotamia, the tabernacle was a mobile sanctuary, signaling a God who traveled with his people rather than being tied to a single sacred site. In many ways, it subverted the ancient worldview that gods were geographically bound. Here was Yahweh, the creator, unbound by territory, yet choosing to dwell with his people wherever they went. Now, the next section of the chapter describes the courtyard surrounding the tabernacle. It was to be enclosed by linen curtains, supported by pillars set in bronze bases with silver hooks and bands. Linen made from flax fibers was associated with purity and high status in the ancient world. Producing it was labor intensive, requiring harvesting, soaking, beating, and spinning before weaving. This was not common cloth. It was valuable and symbolized the separation of the holy space from the ordinary world. The linen curtains were high enough, about 7.5 feet, to block the view of those outside. The courtyard was both an invitation and a boundary. You could enter, but only through the prescribed way, the eastern gate. The orientation of the courtyard is another fascinating anthropological detail. Its entrance faced east, which in the ancient Near East was often associated with beginnings, life, and divine light. Now the sun rose in the east, and for the Israelites, this directional symbolism may have carried echoes of Eden, where God placed humanity and from which they were exiled. Approaching the tabernacle from the east could be seen as a symbolic return towards God's presence. In many cultures, facing east during worship signified turning towards divine order and renewal. Bronze dominated the courtyard, its bases, its pegs, its altar, further reinforcing the idea of strength and judgment. Now, silver, used in the hooks and bands, was often associated with redemption in biblical imagery, possibly reflecting the ransom each Israelite paid for the service of the tabernacle, as described in Exodus 30. Now, every material here was meaningful. The tabernacle was a microcosm of creation, ordered and purposeful, with each element teaching Israel about God's holiness, justice, and mercy. This chapter ends with instructions for the oil of the lampstand, which was to be pure olive oil, pressed by hand rather than crushed with a mill. This produced a cleaner burning oil, free from impurities that would cause smoke. Olive oil in the ancient Near East was a prized commodity used for food, anointing, and light. The requirement for pure oil was more than a matter of efficiency. It was a statement about the purity of worship. The lamps were to burn continually, tended by Aaron and his sons, from the evening to the morning as a perpetual statute. This continuous light symbolized God's enduring presence among his people. From an anthropological angle, perpetual flames were a common feature in many ancient temples, from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Now they represented the ongoing life of the deity and the unbroken link between the divine and the human realm. In Israel's case, the lampstand's light was not the God itself, as in pagan temples, but a sign pointing to the God who was truly present. It was a theological correction in material form. The light was not an object of worship, but a reminder of the one who is the light. Culturally, this chapter reinforces how Israel's worship both fit within and stood apart from the surrounding world. Like their neighbors, they had sacred spaces, altars, and priestly duties. Unlike their neighbors, these elements were infused with covenant theology, rooted in God's revelation rather than human invention. The tabernacle was not a human attempt to reach the divine. It was the divine choosing to dwell among humans. One detail worth reflecting on is the people's role in providing the materials. The acacia wood, the bronze, the linen, the oil, all of these came from the contributions of the Israelites themselves. This was participatory worship. Everyone had a hand in making the place where God would meet them. In a world where temples were often built by kings to glorify themselves and their gods, the tabernacle was built by a redeemed people as a dwelling for the God who had saved them. Theologically, Exodus 27 invites us to see worship as both sacred and communal. The altar was not hidden in an inner sanctum. It was in the courtyard, visible to all. Sacred Sacrifice was not a private matter, but a public declaration of faith and dependence on God. The ritual light was not the work of a single priest, but the result of an ongoing supply of oil from the community. This integration of individual participation and communal identity is a powerful model for worship today. As we think about how these ancient instructions might speak to us now, it's worth noting that the balance between beauty, function, and meaning, nothing in the tabernacle was arbitrary. The materials that were chosen for durability, symbolism, and holiness. The layout reflected theological truths. The rituals reinforced that identity. Even the direction you faced mattered. In our own worship spaces, whether grand cathedrals or simple living rooms, we can learn from this intentionality. Worship is not just about what we say or sing. It's about the spaces we create and the meanings we embed in them. And finally, I want to close with a loving reflection. The God who gave these detailed instructions is the same God who moves towards his people today. He is still intentional, still present, still calling us to create spaces in our hearts, in our homes, and in our communities where his presence should be honored. The tabernacle's altar reminds us that that approach to God involves surrender. The courtyard reminds us that his presence is both a gift and a calling. The lamp light reminds us that his presence is unending. And just as the Israelites brought their offerings to make this sanctuary possible, we are invited to bring our own, our time, our talents, our devotion to the God who dwells with us. Thank you again for staying with me through this journey into Exodus 27. I'd love to hear your thoughts, insights, or questions in the comments. What stood out to you in this chapter? What connections do you see between this ancient worship space and our walk with God today? We're learning together, and I'm grateful to share this journey with you. Thank you again for joining with me today, and we will see you in the next chapter tomorrow.